Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses. Everyone had great presentations, and Mr. Chairman, thank you for the selection of such a wide, diverse panel. I'd like to start my question with Mr. Sines from MELDA. You noted accurately that there's been a population growth among Latinos different than other groups in the country. In fact, in Texas, 95% of the population growth that has led to perhaps getting 2 seats additional to our congressional delegation was 95% people of color, primarily more Latinos. So in Texas, about half of all the people under 18 are Latino. And the numbers will change even dramatically more in the next decade. And you've had a long history of defending and litigating the Latino issues in our state. How does historical evidence demonstrate that the growth in population among a racial minority or language minority group as Latinos catalyzes changes in the voting practices of a particular jurisdiction to limit their voting strength?
Thank you, Congressman. I think the history is quite clear, and it was presented 2 weeks ago by Professor Bernard Fraga about this notion of a tipping point, that when you do get to a point of growth for a minority voting community, that's often when those in power seek to deter further participation. And unfortunately, as you know, the state of Texas is an example of that. The very same predominance of minority population growth yielding additional seats occurred a decade ago. But as you know, in response to that, the Texas legislature drew initial lines under which none of the 3 new seats earned by the state of Texas went to minority voters. It took court intervention under Section 2 to secure, I misspoke, there were 4 additional seats, to secure 2 of the 4 new seats for the growing population of people of color that you described. And indeed, the court, in ruling on that Section 2 case, concluded that it was not only vote dilution, but it was intentional discrimination on the basis of race against Black and Latino voters in the state of Texas. That is an example on a statewide basis of where this tipping point phenomenon has acted in the past to catalyze behaviors that violate voting rights. I simply have to add that even though that 3-judge court found intentional discrimination and followed another 3-judge court in Washington, D.C. that concluded the same, it still exercised its discretion to deny preclearance coverage, judicially ordered preclearance coverage for the state of Texas. It's another indication, in my view, why we must step in with congressionally enacted coverage for preclearance.
Well, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield now to our former Vice Chair of our committee, Ms. Scanlon, for my remaining 2 minutes to ask any questions that you may have.
Thank you.
We're going to leave this, but you can find it online at cspan.org. Take you live now to the White House for a briefing with Press Secretary Jen Psaki and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan.
Thank you, Jen, and hello, everybody. I'm going to start with just an update in terms of the President's engagement today in engaging with his national security team, and then make a few comments broadly on the situation, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. This morning, the President spoke with his military commanders for an operational briefing on the security at the Hamid Karzai International Airport, commonly known as HKIA. He spoke with Secretary Austin, Chairman Milley, General McKenzie, Admiral Vaisley, and myself. The President was briefed that DoD personnel have now secured HKIA. HKIA is open, and U.S. military evacuation flights are taking off. Following this operational briefing with his military commanders, the President and the Vice President met by secure video conference with their national security team to hear intelligence, security, and diplomatic updates on the evolving situation in Afghanistan. They discussed the status of ongoing evacuations of U.S. citizens, SIV applicants, and other vulnerable Afghans at risk, and how we would do this safely and efficiently, and with a laser focus of the team on monitoring for and preventing any potential terrorist threats at or around HKIA, including from ISIS-K. They were joined by Secretary Blinken, Secretary Austin, Chairman Milley, Director Haynes, Director Burns, myself, Ambassador Wilson, Ambassador Khalilzad, General McKenzie, and other senior officials. Just to say a few words about where we come from and where we are. I want to start by saluting our troops and our civilian personnel at the Kabul airport. I want to salute the Defense Department, the intelligence community, the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, and especially our country team in Kabul, who have been doing incredible work under very trying circumstances. They have safely and effectively drawn down our embassy compound and retrograded our diplomatic personnel. They have now secured the airfield and are conducting flights out of the country. They are moving American citizens, as well as Afghan nationals and third country nationals. They are facilitating flights for our allies and partners to get citizens and others out of Afghanistan. These operations will continue in the coming days as we move to evacuate American citizens and Afghan nationals who worked with us, along with other vulnerable Afghans. We are engaging diplomatically at the same time with allies in regional countries and with the United Nations to address the situation in Afghanistan. We are in contact with the Taliban to ensure the safe passage of people to the airport. We are monitoring for any potential terrorist threats, as I just mentioned, including from ISIS-K. We intend to continue these operations over the coming days before completing our drawdown. When you work on any policy issue, domestic policy, foreign policy, any policy issue, the human costs and consequences loom large. And we're all contending with the human costs of these developments. The images from the past couple of days at the airport have been heartbreaking. But President Biden had to think about the human costs of the alternative path as well, which was to stay in the middle of a civil conflict in Afghanistan. There are those who argue that with 2,500 forces, the number of forces in country when President Biden took office, we could have sustained a stable, peaceful Afghanistan. That is simply wrong. The previous administration drew down from 15,000 troops to 2,500 troops. And even at 15,000, the Afghan government forces were losing ground. What has unfolded over the past month has proven decisively that it would have taken a significant American troop presence, multiple times greater than what President Biden was handed, to stop a Taliban onslaught. And we would have taken casualties. American men and women would have been fighting and dying once again in Afghanistan, and President Biden was not prepared to send additional forces or ask any American personnel to do that over the period ahead. There have been questions raised about whether we should have drawn down our embassy and evacuated our Afghan allies earlier. These are reasonable questions. We did dramatically accelerate the SIV process and move out a substantial number of SIV applicants and their families. But the Afghan government and its supporters, including many of the people now seeking to leave, made a passionate case that we should not conduct a mass evacuation lest we trigger a loss of confidence in the government. Now, our signaling support for the government obviously did not save the government, but this was a considered judgment. When you conclude 20 years of military action in a civil war in another country with the impacts of 20 years of decisions that have piled up, you have to make a lot of hard calls, none with clean outcomes. What you can do is plan for all contingencies. We did that. The American forces now on the ground at HKIA are there because of contingency planning and drilling we did over the course of months, preparing for a range of scenarios, including dire scenarios. President Biden ordered multiple battalions to be pre-positioned in theater, and he activated them for deployment before the fall of Kabul. He also put additional battalions on a short string here in the United States. Those battalions have now flowed in as well. Yes, there were chaotic scenes yesterday, but as Admiral Kirby said, even well-drawn plans don't survive first contact with reality, and they require adjustments, and we've made those adjustments. We will stay in close touch with our allies and partners in the days ahead as we contend with the immediate need to complete the evacuation mission and as we deal with the broader challenges posed by the new reality in Afghanistan. And we will remain persistently vigilant against the terrorism threat in Afghanistan and in multiple other theaters across multiple continents. We have proven in other places that we can suppress terrorism without a permanent military presence on the ground, and we intend to do exactly that in Afghanistan. And with that, I would be happy to take your questions. Yes.
So I wanted to ask, the president yesterday said that the buck stops with him. I want to get an understanding of what did he mean by, what is he taking ownership of? Not just the decision to leave Afghanistan, but is he taking responsibility for the chaos that happened during the evacuations, for the decisions not to do evacuations sooner? Is he taking responsibility for that, and for any bloodshed that may be happening right now? Is he taking responsibility for that?
He's taking responsibility for every decision the United States government took with respect to Afghanistan because, as he said, the buck stops with him. I am also taking responsibility, and so are my colleagues, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the directors of our intelligence agencies. We as a national security team collectively take responsibility for every decision, good decision, every decision that doesn't produce perfect outcomes. That is what responsibility is. Now, at the same time, that doesn't change the fact that there are other parties here responsible as well, who have taken actions and decisions that help lead us to where we are. So from our perspective, what we have to do now is focus on the task at hand, the mission at hand. You mentioned chaos at the airport yesterday. At the end of the day, the question is, can we effectively evacuate those people who we intend to evacuate? And that is what we are planning for and executing against beginning today, where the airport is secure, the flights are going, the people are coming, and we will continue to do that in the days ahead. Yes?
Yeah, what is President Biden's response to the people of Afghanistan who are now in the hands of the Taliban terrorists and feel abandoned by the United States, or to those in Taiwan and elsewhere that are fearful that the U.S. will abandon them to the aggression of China? And follow-up to that is, what is President Biden's response to people in Israel and other countries who might also believe that the U.S. will abandon them to terrorists?
So to the first question, President Biden and all of us, as I said in my opening comments, are heartbroken by the human consequences that have unfolded and could continue to unfold in Afghanistan. We believe passionately in human rights and human dignity, and we want to work with the international community to advance that wherever we can. But President Biden was not prepared to have American men and women continue to fight and die in the civil war of another country in order to achieve that. We will use every other tool at our disposal to achieve that, and we will do so day after day, month after month in the period ahead on behalf of the people of Afghanistan. To your question about allies, we gave 20 years of American blood, treasure, sweat, and tears in Afghanistan. We gave them every capacity in terms of training and equipment to stand up and fight for themselves. And at some point, it was the time for the United States to say that the Afghan people had to stand up for themselves. We believe that our commitments to our allies and partners are sacrosanct and always have been. We believe our commitment to Taiwan and to Israel remains as strong as it's ever been. Keep in mind that with respect to Afghanistan, we said back in 2011 that we would be out in 2014. We stayed another 7 years, far and above and beyond the commitment that we made more than a decade ago. And the last thing that I would say is that President Biden is laser focused on accomplishing the core national security objectives of the United States. And when it comes to Afghanistan, that was getting bin Laden and degrading al-Qaeda. We accomplished that, and he believes it was time for our troops to come home. Yes.
So just now, Jake, you described a kind of choice that the president that was in front of the president. Either save the folks, the allies in Afghanistan, the folks that helped the United States through the last 2 decades, or sacrifice more American young men. I think the question out there on Capitol Hill and around Washington and elsewhere is, wasn't there another choice? Wasn't there a way you could have ended, President Biden could have ended the war in the way that he wanted to end the war so that Americans don't sacrifice further lives for this war, but at the same time do a better job of either ignoring Ghani's request to not start evacuations, or figuring some way that we wouldn't end up in a situation where there's masses of people crushing through the airport, and the execution of the last 4, 5, 6 days that has seemed to just about everybody as not, is not the way a competent administration, not the result that a competent administration, has in the end. So isn't that a false choice? And why couldn't you do both?
So first, what I would say is that we were clear-eyed going in when we made this decision that it was possible that the Taliban would end up in control of Afghanistan. We were clear-eyed about that. Now, as the President said in his remarks yesterday, we did not anticipate that it would happen at this speed, though we were planning for these potential contingencies. The reason I say that at the outset, that we knew it was possible they could take over, and that had to be built into our calculus in making the determination, as the President did, to draw down our forces, is because once the Taliban came into Kabul, we were going to be faced with a situation, no matter if there were still U.S. troops on the ground or no U.S. troops on the ground, of dealing with a significant number of people wanting to come to an airport to try to get evacuated. I'll give you an example. We communicated with American citizens for weeks, telling them to get out of the country. We offered financial assistance for those who wouldn't be able to afford to get on flights themselves. Many chose to stay right till the end, and that was their choice. We now are faced with a circumstance where we have to help evacuate those. That's our responsibility as the U.S. government. But the point I'm making is that when a civil war comes to an end with an opposing force marching on the Capitol, there are going to be scenes of chaos. There are going to be lots of people leaving the country. That is not something that can be fundamentally avoided. And so while it is a point for reasonable debate, in my view, as to how to think about the right moment to signal a complete loss of confidence in a government or not, and which is going to lead to more suffering and death or not. The fact is that we made the judgments we made based on the information we had at the time while preparing for the alternative contingency, which was having to flow in these troops to be able to get out folks in a mass evacuation. Yes?
Do you believe that the mission could be completed by August 31st? As a national security advisor, what do you see the scenario on September 1st? Do you think the Taliban of 2021 are different than 2001? Do you see analogous situation to Iraq where a new terrorist organization will be born, like ISIS out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, for example?
So just on the last point, it's fairly well documented that the Taliban and ISIS-K fight one another, struggle against one another. So I do not foresee a symbiotic relationship there, though these are dynamic scenarios, so we will have to see how it plays. We are working day by day to get as many people out. So I'm not going to speculate on the timetable question that you just laid out. And then finally, on what we expect from the Taliban going forward, that is something that will have to be watched and observed over time, whether in fact they are prepared to meet their obligations to the basic human rights and human dignity of people, to the safe passage of people to the airport, to the fair and just treatment of civilians. That is something they're going to have to show. I come at this with no expectations, but only a sense that they will have to prove to the international community who they ultimately are going to end up being. Yes.
Thank you, Jake. Can you tell us what is it exactly, the commitment that you have secured from the Taliban regarding the safe passage of Americans as well as the tens of thousands of vulnerable Afghans?
The Taliban have informed us that they are prepared to provide the safe passage of civilians to the airport, and we intend to hold them to that commitment.
Do you believe them?
Yes.
Just for clarity on that, is there some deadline that's been set? Has the Taliban given assurances that this will go till August 31st? Is the deadline before that or after that? For clarity on what you just said.
We believe that this can go till the 31st. We are talking to them about what the exact timetable is for how this will all play out, and I don't want to negotiate in public on working out the best modality to get the most people out in the most efficient way possible. Yes.
I have a question about yesterday. President Biden said that the United States military cannot sacrifice where there is no national interest. If the same analogous, will the U.S. withdraw troops from its allies, including South Korea? What is your comment?
So the president, as he has said repeatedly, has no intention of drawing down our forces from South Korea or from Europe, where we have sustained troop presences for a very long time, not in the middle of a civil war, but to deal with the potential of an external enemy and to protect our ally against that external enemy. So it is a fundamentally different kind of situation from the one we are presented with in Afghanistan.
Thank you. The president yesterday said the situation in Afghanistan unfolded more quickly than anticipated. You said it yourself just a few moments ago. But numerous officials have told ABC that there were key intelligence assessments warning the Taliban could overwhelm the country and take the capital within weeks. Did the White House disregard that intelligence and push ahead?
I'm not actually familiar with the intelligence assessment you're describing, but I also don't want to get into specific intelligence products. And one thing I will not do from this podium or anywhere else is talk about what a different component of the interagency did or didn't do, because from my perspective, we are one team with one mission trying to execute and do so in the best interests of our interests and values. So I will leave it at that.
If that mission is not complete by August 31st, and there are Americans and Afghan allies who remain there, will U.S. troops stay until everyone is out, or will they leave?
So I'm not going to comment on hypotheticals. What I'm going to do is stay focused on the task at hand, which is getting as many people out as rapidly as possible, and we will take that day by day.
So you can't commit to bringing back every American.
There's a large number of Christian missionaries and aid workers that are particularly vulnerable because they're known to be Christians. Is there any plan to get them to the airport and get them out?
We are working with a variety of different types of groups, journalists, aid workers, NGO workers, and so forth, to help facilitate their departure from the country. Yes.
Talk about these contingency plans. The President of the United States left the White House on Friday. When did your administration know that another 6,000 troops were going to be needed for this withdrawal?
So on Wednesday evening, the President convened the principals, this is last Wednesday evening, to discuss the deteriorating situation on the ground in Afghanistan. He posed the question as to whether we had to flow more forces in from the point of view of a contingency to draw down our embassy and to secure evacuation. Thursday morning, he gave the order to begin flowing those forces in. And then as we watched the situation unfold over the course of the coming days, we determined that we would go from step one of that contingency plan, which was about 3,000 troops, to step two of that contingency plan, which was about 6,000 troops.
Why did he leave the White House? If on Thursday he knew, why did he leave the White House on Friday?
The President worked throughout the entire weekend. I was intimately familiar with his working habits over the course of the weekend because I was on the phone with him constantly. Secretary Austin was on the phone with him, Chairman Milley, Secretary Blinken, the team in country. So he was monitoring developments hour by hour throughout that entire time and has been making a series of decisions about troop deployments, giving us direction and guidance about how to take the shape of this mission and make sure that we're executing it, and at every turn asking our military, who is leading this mission and executing this mission with bravery and valor, what do you need? I will get you anything you need. He asked that question multiple times every single day. So President Biden has been deeply engaged in this. Yes.
Jake, sorry, there's a lot of anger in Australia this morning about the way this has played out. We've got citizens and then of course so many Afghans who have helped the Australian forces and helping the US mission over the past 20 years. Does the administration accept some responsibility, or perhaps what would be your response to those people who are trapped and some are fearing execution because of the exit strategy, or perhaps lack of competent exit strategy?
We do take some responsibility for our allies and partners in Afghanistan. In fact, as I said in my opening comments, we are working to facilitate flights and have already done so for countries that have lined them up and gotten their citizens to the airport. And we'll be eager to work with Australia to help get out Australian citizens and other individuals who the Australians would like to see get out. Yes.
Jake, what do you say to the next generation of Afghan women and children, young girls who face fundamentally different human rights moving forward?
I say that truly, deeply, my heart goes out to Afghan women and girls in the country today under the Taliban. We've seen what they've done before. And that's a very hard thing for any of us to face. But this wasn't a choice just between saving those women and girls and not saving those women and girls. The alternative choice had its own set of human costs and consequences, as I said. And those human costs and consequences would have involved a substantial ramp-up of American participation in a civil war with more loss of life, more bloodshed, families here in the United States who would be asking a different form of the question you just asked. These are the choices a president has to make. And it doesn't mean, because we don't have forces in that country, that we're not going to fight on behalf of women and girls and human rights and human dignity. We are. We do. In many other countries where we don't have active military participation. And we'll do it in Afghanistan too, and we will attempt to use every measure of tool and influence we have, along with our international allies and partners, to alleviate the burden that those women and girls will face in the days ahead. We are absolutely, resolutely committed to that. Yes.
Do you recognize the Taliban as the legitimate governing power in Afghanistan now?
Right now, there is a chaotic situation in Kabul where we don't even have the establishment of a governing authority, so it would be really premature to address that question. Ultimately, it's going to be up to the Taliban to show the rest of the world who they are and how they intend to proceed. The track record has not been good, but it's premature to address that question at this point. Yes.
You said that the Taliban is committed to safe passage to the airport, but our reporting is that they've set up checkpoints outside the airport. People are being beaten and whipped when they try and cross these checkpoints, and that some of the evacuation flights are leaving nearly empty as a result. What assurances do you have specifically about these checkpoints, and when do you expect them to stop doing this?
So two things about that. First, the earliest evacuation flights in any evacuation tend not to have every seat filled because the process of getting any evacuation underway has a throughput issue. So we believe that that is being resolved with each successive flight, and we will be putting 300 passengers on your average military cargo plane heading out of the country, one after another, hot onloading and hot offloading. Second, in terms of people being turned away, by and large, what we have found is that people have been able to get to the airport. In fact, very large numbers of people have been able to get to the airport and present themselves. There have been instances where we have received reports of people being turned away or pushed back or even beaten. We are taking that up in a channel with the Taliban to try to resolve those issues, and we are concerned about whether that will continue to unfold in the coming days. As things stand right now, what we are finding is that we are getting people through the gate, we are getting them lined up, and we are getting them on planes, but this is an hour-by-hour issue, and it's something we are clear-eyed about and very focused on holding the Taliban accountable to follow through on its commitment. Yes.
Jake, thanks so much. You've talked about your confidence in the contingency planning, and I'm wondering if, in hindsight, looking at the planning and execution, what this administration would have done differently, knowing what it knows now.
It's a good question, and it's one that we will conduct an extensive hot wash, as we say. We'll take a look at every aspect of this from top to bottom. But sitting here today, I'm spending every hour I have focused on how we execute the mission we have before us, which is getting all of these people out. Yes.
Jake, two questions for you. One, has the president spoken to any other world leaders since Kabul fell to the Taliban?
Oh, sorry, I was looking at the wrong person. He has not yet spoken with any other world leaders. Myself, Secretary Blinken, several other senior members of the team have been engaged on a regular basis with foreign counterparts, and we intend to do so in the coming days. Right now, the main issue is an operational issue. It's about how we coordinate with them to help them get their people out. And we are operating through logistical channels and policy channels to try to make that happen.
And Jake,
Yes.
just to follow up on that, you just said that you will conduct a review of what went wrong here on the U.S.'s response. I know you said there are other additional factors, like what happened on the ground in Afghanistan that led to this. Will you publicly disclose what went wrong and who misjudged the intelligence here over how quickly the Taliban could take over?
So first, I didn't describe that we were doing a, quote, what went wrong review. What I said is we'll do a hot wash. We'll look at everything that happened in this entire operation from start to finish, and the areas of improvement where we can do better, where we can find holes or weaknesses and plug them as we go forward. And of course, we intend, after we've had the opportunity to run that analysis, to share that with people. Yes.
Thank you, sir. You noted that you had encouraged Americans on the ground there to leave and that many chose not to. I just wanted to follow up on Wija's question. Will the U.S. government commit to ensuring that any Americans that are currently on the ground in Afghanistan get out?
That's what we're doing right now. We have asked them all to come to the airport to get on flights and take them home. That's what we intend to do. Yes.
Former officials from multiple administrations, the Obama administration, the Bush administration, have said they are certain Afghanistan will become a safe haven for terrorists. I know you and the president have disputed that. What do you think those officials are getting wrong, and can you ensure that Americans are safer today because of your actions than we were several months ago?
I want to be very clear about what our position is. Our position is that we are going to have to deal with the potential threat of terrorism from Afghanistan going forward, just as we have to deal with the potential threat of terrorism in dozens of countries in multiple continents around the world. We have to deal with the threat of terrorism in Yemen and Somalia and Syria. We have to deal with the threat of terrorism across the Islamic Maghreb. We have to deal with Al-Qaeda and ISIS-K. And we have to do so using a wide variety of tools, intelligence capabilities, defense capabilities, and yes, in some cases, the support we can provide to local partners to help them deal with the challenge. And what we have shown is in many of the countries I just mentioned, among others, we have been successful to date in suppressing the terrorist threat to the U.S. homeland in those countries without sustaining a permanent military presence or fighting in a war. And that is what we intend to do with respect to Afghanistan as well. So this is not a question about whether we're clear-eyed about the terrorist challenge from Afghanistan. It is about whether the terrorist challenge in 2021 is fundamentally different from the terrorist challenge in 2001. We believe it is fundamentally different, and we need to be postured effectively to deal with the terrorism challenges we find it today as opposed to 20 years ago.
Just wondering, can you shed light on the decision to leave behind Blackhawks and other equipment, how that fits in with the contingency plan the U.S. had?
Leave behind
Blackhawks and other equipment. Why give the Taliban access to state-of-the-art equipment that they could either use to bolster their own defenses or to sell off to other countries?
This is, I think, a very good example of the difficult choices a president faces and a Secretary of Defense and a Secretary of State and a National Security Advisor face in the context of the end of a 20-year war. Those Blackhawks were not given to the Taliban. They were given to the Afghan National Security Forces to be able to defend themselves at the specific request of President Ghani, who came to the Oval Office and asked for additional air capability, among other things. So the president had a choice. He could not give it to them with the risk that it would fall into the Taliban's hands eventually. Or he could give it to them with the hope that they could deploy it in service of defending their country. Both of those options had risks. He had to choose, and he made a choice. And from the point of view of that particular narrow example to a much wider range of examples that we contend with, at the end of the day, what the president has focused on all the way through here is trying to take the information that's been presented to him, the risks, costs, and benefits, and make decisions that were in the best national security interests of the American people. He has tried to do that. He talked about that at length yesterday. And from that perspective, he believes the decision he made in this context was the right decision. Yes.
Thank you. The president has not been shy about undoing many of the previous president's policies, many of them. Why not undo this one, particularly since the Taliban have abrogated already what they agreed to back in Doha with President Trump?
You're referring to the agreement that President Trump made with the Taliban in February of 2020, which set a deadline, be out by May 1st, 2021. Walking away from that was not just kind of a cost-free proposition for the United States. On May 2nd, the Taliban offensive was going to start. The Taliban onslaught was going to happen. And the question facing the president was, would increasing numbers of American troops be in the teeth of that offensive, or would we draw it down and try and give all the capabilities necessary for the Afghan government and the Afghan army to step up to that? That is the decision that he took. That is the situation that he was placed in, with a mere 2,500 troops in country when he took over. This was a choice between dramatically ramping up forces to fight or drawing them down to end our military involvement, and that's the choice that he made. Yes.
Jake, the president said yesterday that he urged Afghan leaders to engage in diplomacy and seek a political settlement with the Taliban, but, quote, this advice was flatly refused. Does the president feel he had a willing partner in President Ghani?
Look, I would just say the president was reporting the facts as they unfolded. I'm not going to characterize anything about President Ghani at this point, who is no longer a factor in Afghanistan, and I don't think there's much merit in me weighing in more deeply on him. Yes.
Mr. Sullivan, sorry to labour the point here, but we're speaking to Afghan citizens who supported the American mission in Afghanistan, who are now terrified for their lives. Can you confirm that when it gets to August 31st and your troops leave, will you abandon them or will you stay and save them?
Our plan is to safely evacuate the people who worked with the United States, who are eligible for special immigrant visas, which is a generous program set up on a bipartisan basis by our Congress. We have identified those individuals and families. We are making provision to have them come to the airport and get on evacuation flights out of the country. That is what we are going to do between now and the end of the month. Yes.
Thank you, Jake. One question. Going back to President Ghani, have any top officials of the Afghani government, the former Afghani government, made requests for asylum in the United States? And would President Ghani and Vice President Abdullah, among others, be welcomed in the U.S.?
I'm not familiar with any such requests, and I'm not going to get into hypotheticals. Yes.
Thanks, Jake. With the president at Camp David, can we, the American people, expect to hear from him in the coming days as the operation to get people out continues?
I'll leave it to Jen to answer that, but yes, you will hear from him in the coming days. Yes.
President, thanks for taking my question. President Biden was expected to repair the damage caused by the previous administration to the NATO. The way the withdrawal was carried out added new strength to the alliance. How severe is this damage, and what you would tell your allies?
President Biden has a long and deep history of solidarity and commitment to the NATO alliance. His commitment to Article 5 is rock solid and sacrosanct. We just had a very successful NATO summit where we committed to a new strategic concept and a new way forward on the emerging threats we're going to face. He believes in his personal bonds with the leaders of NATO, and he believes in the institutional bonds between the United States and NATO. And I would just note also that our Secretary of State and our Secretary of Defense went to repeated ministerial meetings at NATO for consultations on this decision, and ultimately secured an agreement of the North Atlantic Council for it to be carried out along the timetable that was laid out. All of the allies signed up to that. What the president also committed to was making sure that every last NATO troop on the ground in Afghanistan, and there were more NATO troops in Afghanistan than American troops when Joe Biden took office, would get out safely and securely without incurring a single casualty, and he executed that. And then finally, he's committed to facilitating the flights of our NATO allies and partners to get their civilians out and to get others out. And he is in the process of doing that. In fact, planes from NATO countries have landed and taken off with their personnel over the course of the past 24 hours.
I think your previous answers are not enough to assure U.S. allies and partners, because first Korean War broke out as a civil war. If the United States commit only to places that without civil war, how can you ensure allies that the United States will defend them in a crisis that can describe as a civil war. For example, if the People's Republic of China attacks Taiwan, the Chinese can argue that it is a civil war among the Chinese, and how can you justify the U.S. involvement in Taiwan and South Korea? And I also understand the United States did not want to make a sacrifice, but at the same time, leadership requires a sacrifice. And how can you just claim to be a global leader without making sacrifice?
So I want to start where your question ended, because the United States made an extraordinary sacrifice in Afghanistan. 2,448 Americans lost their lives in Afghanistan. Tens of thousands of Americans were injured in the war in Afghanistan over 20 years, trying to help that country stand up and being able to defend itself. The United States spent more than $1 trillion of its resources in Afghanistan. The amount of sacrifice and solidarity and commitment to Afghanistan, to trying to give it a chance, was immense. And it wasn't just the United States. Many other countries joined us and had their own sacrifice. Excuse me, let me just finish answering the question. And so the idea that there was a lack of sacrifice on the part of the American people is belied by the rows of headstones over at Arlington National Cemetery, where people have come home. When it comes to Taiwan, it is a fundamentally different question in a different context. And so from our perspective, what we need to focus on, well, I'm sorry, if I'll take the next question if you won't let me answer. Yeah.
So what's your take on the conference earlier by the Taliban, especially the comments that they made about protecting women's rights? Do you have any trust in the fact that they're going to hold up to it?
Like I've said all along, this is not about trust. This is about verify. And we'll see what the Taliban end up doing in the days and weeks ahead. And when I say we, I mean the entire international community. Yes.
The Biden administration has talked a lot about evacuating American and Afghan who helped the U.S. in the war, but there were many foreign nationals, including many Africans who were there. What's the administration doing to evacuate them safely?
So the United States is also focused on helping third country nationals get out of the country safely. Yes.
Back in the spring, you and several administration officials committed that civilian and humanitarian aid would continue into Afghanistan. Now that the Taliban has taken over the government, does that just completely stop? Is there a possibility that that would restart at some point?
We will have to take a hard look at how we proceed with on any basis at all. And as I said to one of your colleagues earlier, it's premature to answer those questions. That's something we will have to take a look at after we get through the immediate task of this mission. Yeah, at the back.
What is the status of the Afghan security forces and the U.S. relationship with them?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
The Afghan security forces and the U.S. relationship with them.
The Afghan security forces appear to have essentially, no longer operate as a coherent entity. They essentially have given way to Taliban physical security control over the major population centers. Yes.
What relationship with them?
Follow-up question on follow-up question about the Taliban saying they'll respect the rights of Afghan women. What tools does the United States have to hold them to this pledge? And if not, what does the U.S. plan to do?
So standing here today, I am not going to go into the full panoply of things that we can do, but there are obviously issues related to sanctions, to marshaling international condemnation and isolation, and other steps as well. But the reason I don't want to go into great detail on it is I want to be able to have our team communicate directly to the Taliban both what the costs and disincentives are for certain types of action and what our expectations are. That is a conversation that we will intend to have, and I think many other countries, including like-minded allies and partners, will be having that as well. Yes.
Thank you, sir. President Biden said that there were very few national security interests for the United States
in maintaining some peace in Afghanistan. Would you actually reiterate that today? Would you say that there is no interest for us having some presence on the borders of Iran, on the borders of Pakistan, on the borders of near China? Would you, or Tajikistan? Would you just say that we should just give that up?
I would say that the president does not believe that the United States should be fighting and dying in a war for the purpose of sustaining American military boots near Tajikistan or Pakistan or Iran. No, I would say that that is something that is not. What you just laid out as a national security interest, we would not agree that it is right to ask American soldiers to risk their lives for the purpose of maintaining a presence near Tajikistan. Yes.
Thank you. What happens to the billions of dollars worth of weaponry that the U.S. gave Afghanistan? Does the U.S. have a plan for that, or does it remain in the Taliban hands?
We don't have a complete picture, obviously, of where every article of defense materials has gone, but certainly a fair amount of it has fallen into the hands of the Taliban. And obviously, we don't have a sense that they are going to readily hand it over to us at the airport. Yes.
Thank you, Jake. Has the president seen these images of what looks to be people flying off an airplane yesterday? And then what was his reaction to those images?
The president, as he said in his remarks yesterday, has seen these images are heartbreaking. And as I've said repeatedly today, the human toll of the end of this conflict in this way is real and it's raw. And it's hard for any of us. You guys are journalists. I work in government, but you know, we're also people. And this is tough stuff. There's no doubt about it. But these are hard choices too. And at the end of the day, the president had to make a hard choice about whether to avoid some of those human costs. The United States continues to send thousands of troops to fight, and some of them die and take casualties. That is the decision that he was not prepared to take. Yes.
Thank you, Jay, for the question. I just want to get your reaction to the Special Inspector General report on Afghanistan. I know this was planned before the fall of Kabul, but I just want to get your response to that. And also, how are you going to ensure that Americans and other people, refugees perhaps, have safe passage to the airport? I know you talked about securing the airport, but how are you going to ensure that they can actually get there?
So as I said before, we have been working, engaging, coordinating with Taliban elements on the ground to ensure safe passage. We will continue to work that issue day by day until we've completed our mission. And what was your first question?
Yes, your reaction to the Special Inspector General report on the Afghan Reconstruction that basically essentially said that administrations were not prepared to come up with a concrete plan for the reconstruction of Afghanistan?
Look, one of the findings of that report was that 20 years, hundreds of billions of dollars spent, huge number of forces trained, huge amount of capabilities provided, huge amount of advising and assisting, and you had a security force that at the end of the day was not prepared with the will to stand up and fight for itself. And that is the collection of decisions taken over the course of many years. Yes.
Jake, thank you. While we have you, can you address the situation in Haiti? 2 questions regarding that. Will a U.S. military presence be necessary to secure the road between Port-au-Prince and the disaster zone for humanitarian aid? And then secondly, does the earthquake in Haiti affect the administration's view that elections should be held there this year?
So on the second question, it's too early to tell what the impact on the political process of the earthquake is. We are in the process of assessing that. On your first question, right now what we're focused on is getting a USAID DART team. It's been deployed out and active in helping address this. We've got U.S. Coast Guard elements, and Southcom has mobilized with logistical and other support to be able to provide the kind of emergency response that is necessary in a human tragedy and catastrophe like this. There are no current plans to speak of to deploy U.S. military personnel to Haiti. Yes. We'll make this the last one.
Thank you. You said it's too early to say whether the U.S. will recognize the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan. Are there any steps you're taking in the meantime around sanctions or foreign currencies or anything? Is there a chance that if they do take power, that they'd be able to tap into quite a fair bit of money that the U.S. might want to head off the possibility of? Are there any steps you're taking in that regard, sort of preventatively, I suppose?
We're working on those options right now. I don't want to get ahead of the president's decision-making on them, and I'll leave it at that.
If you are working on those options, doesn't then that speak to a doubt that you might never recognize them? If you don't ever recognize them, how can you ensure that the president's promise of aid continuing to the Afghan people will be enacted?
Well, so I don't want to get into hypotheticals, but I would point out that there are a range of different diplomatic relationships the United States has with countries around the world, including some very difficult or non-existent relationships with governments where we still provide forms of aid to people. And I will leave it at that because we're not at a point yet where we can speak directly to how things will play out in Afghanistan, but that's at least a partial answer to your question. I know you guys have many more questions, but I think probably your patience with me is also wearing a bit thin. So I will leave it at that and get back to work.
Thank you. Take my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
COVID safe. I just have a couple of additional updates for you. Some of which was provided by the Department of Defense this morning, but I wanted to make sure you all had this information as well. As you may have seen, the airport, and as Jake noted, is currently open for military flight operations as well as limited commercial flight operations. And throughout the night, 9 C-17s arrived, delivering equipment and approximately 1,000 troops. Additionally, 7 C-17s have departed. These flights lifted approximately 700 to 800 passengers, and we can confirm 165 of these passengers are American citizens. The rest are a mix of SIV applicants and third country nationals. And I would also note that, in addition, the intention is to have additional flights out this morning. There's obviously going to be operational updates that will be provided on a regular basis by the Department of Defense. But as you saw them brief out, our focus over the last 24 to 48 hours has been securing the airport and ensuring that we can begin to expedite flights of both American citizens, SIV applicants, and others out. I also just wanted to note that this morning, on a different topic, Biden administration officials joined a meeting of the U.S. Conference of Mayors to discuss our eviction prevention efforts. CDC Director Rochelle Walensky provided an update on the state of the pandemic, and Associate Attorney General Vinita Gupta reiterated ways that mayors across the country can work closely with state and local courts to set up eviction diversion programs in their city. This meeting is just the latest in our efforts to communicate and work with local officials to ensure we're getting assistance out to keep people in their homes. I know we've been here a while, but I know there are lots of topics out there. Go ahead, Josh.
Thanks, Jen. With regard to the booster shots, how many shots does the U.S. have available for boosters? And will supplying boosters have any impact on U.S. vaccine donations around the world?
So let me first note that tomorrow the COVID-19 team and our health and medical experts will host a briefing and we'll discuss next steps as it relates to boosters. I would also note for your planning that you can expect to hear from the President on this topic as well following their briefing. So I will leave it to them to provide additional details and to answer what I know are your good questions about data and an understanding of what leads to decisions along those lines. On the supply component of that, I'm sure they will address that, Josh, but one of the things we have said repeatedly, and I will note, I said back in May, Jeff Zients said again in July, is that part of our operational focus was ensuring we had enough supply to provide booster shots should that be a decision made by the FDA. So that has been in our planning processes for months now, and certainly we've planned for this contingency, and we'll wait for a formal announcement.
Does the President plan and the First Lady plan to get booster shots?
Certainly, if they are recommended, once a formal announcement or briefing is done, they will certainly plan to follow the guidelines, of course.
What's the rest of his week look like? He's up at Camp David now. Is he still going to Wilmington? What's the schedule?
Well, I think Rachel asked this earlier, so the President will return to the White House. I don't have an exact time for you, but tomorrow he will both be doing an interview with George Stephanopoulos for ABC, and he will also, where he will, of course, I'm certain, be speaking to the situation on the ground in Afghanistan. He'll also be delivering some remarks on COVID as well. In terms of additional portions of the schedule next week, we're still working those through, so I don't have an update for you at this moment in time. Go ahead.
Thank you. On COVID, is the White House concerned that moving forward with boosters could make it that much harder to get more unvaccinated Americans to get that initial shot?
Well, one of the pieces that I expect our COVID team to speak to tomorrow is our operational plans as it relates to ensuring we are making sure everybody is vaccinated and following FDA and CDC guidelines. I think what you can expect to hear from them is is that we are going to follow some of the best practices we have used to date, which is providing access, providing information, and right now we're in a place where we are focused on providing access, of course, to vaccines around the country and communities around the country through a range of mechanisms. So we're actually at an easier operational point in this regard than we were several months ago. But yes, we understand it's going to take a significant operational focus, educational focus, and PR focus to get the information out once it's finalized.
Thank you. And one more on Afghanistan. Has the president or any administration official been in contact with former Afghanistan President Ghani?
Not that I'm aware of. Go ahead.
Thank you. You mentioned at the top that about 700 people have been evacuated in the past 24 hours. Pentagon officials, including Press Secretary John Kirby, expect that number to increase to 5,000 to 9,000 a day. Can you talk about what needs to happen between now and then to ramp the number up, and when you expect to hit it?
Sure, Weijia, it's a good question. I think what I had been referring to just a few minutes ago was the fact that our focus has been on securing not just the perimeter of the airport, but also operational capacity at the airport, which of course is a Department of Defense operation they're overseeing in coordination with the State Department. And so because we've had success in that regard, we are hopeful and expect to expedite additional flights out. So that was not the place where we were at this time yesterday, and given we've made progress in this regard, we are hopeful to increase the number of people, American citizens, SIV applicants, and others that we can get out of the country.
It's our understanding that Americans have been called to the airport, but it's up to them to travel there at their own risk. Why isn't the U.S. providing any support, any transportation for them to get to Kabul?
Well, I would just go back to what our National Security Advisor discussed as it relates to the Taliban and discussions with them about safe passage for people who are coming to the airport. We've also seen, I don't have an exact number for you, I'm sure the Department of Defense and State Department can provide that, but a large number of American citizens and others making their way successfully to the airport over the course of the last 24 hours.
Just one more. I know we all tried to ask Jake this question, but can you offer any guarantee to the Americans and Afghan allies that if they remain there past the end of the month, U.S. troops will help them evacuate past the end of the month?
Weijia, our focus right now is on doing the work at hand and on the task at hand, and that is day by day getting as many American citizens, as many SIV applicants, as many members of a vulnerable population who are eligible to be evacuated to the airport and out on planes. And we're going to do that in an expeditious fashion. That is the focus of the President, of our Secretary of Defense, of our Secretary of State, and everybody on our national security team. So that is where we will keep our efforts. Go ahead.
Thank you. There's been some criticism from Democratic lawmakers on Capitol Hill, Mark Warner, Bob Menendez saying, I'm disappointed that the Biden administration clearly did not accurately assess the implications of a rapid withdrawal. What is the White House's response to those lawmakers?
Well, I would first say that we did assess early on, when the President asked for a clear-eyed assessment, that there would be impacts and there would be consequences of making the choice he made. He also acknowledged yesterday, and I would just reiterate, that this did happen more rapidly than we anticipated here, than anyone anticipated. I think that accounts for members of Congress and people who are on the ground in Afghanistan. And what our effort is now is focused on moving as many people out as we can from the country. But I would also note and reiterate to anyone who's a critic that any president has to make difficult choices as commander-in-chief, as Jake Sullivan just said. And the president made the choice that he was not going to ask U.S. men and women, servicemen and women, to fight a war that the Afghans were not willing to fight for themselves. It does not mean there aren't going to be impacts that are gut-wrenching, that are heart-wrenching, that we're all watching transpire over the last couple of days. But these are the difficult choices you have to make as commander-in-chief, and that's the choice he made.
And does he still have confidence in his intelligence teams?
He certainly does. He works in lockstep, and he's been briefed on a regular basis, as Jake just outlined, multiple times a day sometimes by members of his national security team, and we're working in close coordination to get the job done each day. Go ahead.
Sort of follow up on Caitlin's questions about criticism from people who are your allies or your friends. David Axelrod has called you the best press secretary in his lifetime, I think.
My mom would like that.
Okay. But he's also said that the events of the last weekend are, this is paraphrasing here, but indefensible, I think. He said you can't defend them. And he has basically said that you guys should acknowledge that it was a failure and be willing to say that the events of the last several days were a failure, even as you maybe, defend the broader question of the drawdown in Afghanistan. What do you say to David Axelrod, who is such a fan of yours?
Mutual. There are a few people I respect as much as David Axelrod in the world of politics. He's brilliant. He's also a great human being. But he would be the first to say that there is a difference between being on the outside and speaking on television and being on the inside, and the difficult choices that you have to make. As I've noted, and as Jake noted, even as we're watching over the last couple of days, heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching photos, you referred to some of them, Mike. The president stands by his decision because he knows it's in the interest of the United States, our national security, and the American people. And he's not going to ask mothers and fathers to send their children to fight a war the Afghans won't fight for themselves. And that does not mean that there aren't chaotic moments. There are. There does not mean there aren't moments that we may look back and take a look at approaches and how to address things moving forward. Of course, that's a part of how you assess governing and how you assess operations moving forward. But right now, and he would be the first, he spent, as you well know, an important role, a vital role, advising President Obama to acknowledge that when you're in government, you're faced with difficult choices. The president is faced with difficult choices, so are members of his team. And what you have to always make the decisions based on is what's in the interest of the American people. Go ahead.
Does the president believe that his orders were executed as intended? In these past couple of days, obviously those images that we've all seen, I mean, is he assessing blame at all for that? And does he feel like he ordered the military to do certain things and they did it as intended?
Well, his order was to deploy additional military men and women to go to Afghanistan to help evacuate American citizens, SIV applicants, and others safely out of the country, some to the United States, and to help our partners and allies around the world as well. We are effectively doing that. And the photos we're seeing of chaotic moments, no doubt, at the airport are of many Afghans who want to get out of the country. We certainly understand that as well. And as Jake just said, when you're at a point where things are happening more quickly than anyone would have anticipated, not just people in this White House, but certainly people in Afghanistan, people in the international community, probably people in Congress, then you're going to have some chaotic scenes. But the president is confident in his national security team and their ability to get the mission done and get the mission accomplished. And as I just noted earlier, right now the airport is secure. We're working to expedite flights and get more people out of the country.
And then just to follow on, the president has been quite clear that he does not have any trust in the Taliban. And so I guess Jake kind of went about this in a couple of different ways, but do you guys have any assurances that the Taliban is clearing the safe passage to the airports? And what are the consequences to them if they do not?
Well, the consequences are the full weight and force of the United States military, and I think we've made that clear. But right now, and we're not trusting, we're not taking their word for it. We are watching closely, we are in close contact, and we are certainly assessing whether they are going to abide by their commitments and by their actions. Go ahead.
How many Americans are in Afghanistan, both inside Kabul and outside Kabul, and should they get priority on evacuation flights? John Kirby said that it's going to be a mix of SIV applicants and Americans, but should those remaining American citizens get priority, and how many are there in the country right now?
Well, we are prioritizing a number of groups: American citizens, embassy employees and their families, our locally employed staff, SIV holders and applicants, Afghans who would be eligible for P1, P2 refugee programs, which includes, by the way, translators who may have assisted media organizations and others. There have been, how the process works, I should tell you, is that there are individuals who will self-identify as American citizens. That number is around 11,000. Beyond that, around the country. Beyond that, though, there are individuals who may not have self-identified, who may come and request assistance and come to the airport. We're going to work to assist, of course, American citizens, but we also have a responsibility and an obligation to help the men and women who served by our sides, many of the sides of your colleagues as translators and as interpreters, and our locally employed staff and others.
So just to confirm, 11,000 in the entire country, not just in Kabul?
Well, I would just say that's the self-identified number, right? So, but we will continue to provide assistance, and we are prioritizing American citizens. We are also working to get additional officials out who have played an important role.
Just to follow up on this, obviously getting them through and getting them to the airport is the challenge, as everyone else here has noted, but the administration's left to negotiate with the Taliban, including one of the commandos who was released from Guantanamo Bay as part of the Bo Bergdahl prisoner swap when President Biden was vice president. How does he feel about that? Does he have any regrets, and how's he digesting that?
Well, first I would note that, one, I'd point you to the Department of the intelligence community to assess the identity of the individual. I know there's been reporting on it, but that's not my position to do from here. I would also note that in prior negotiations and commitments made during the Trump administration, there were thousands of individuals who were released. So our focus right now is on, again, not taking the Taliban's word for it. We are assessing, we are closely watching, and we are being very clear about the capacities and the capabilities we have at hand should they be needed. Of course, that's not our objective.
And then the last question, what are we doing to counter message with what's happening right now with China in Taiwan? The president said yesterday that China and Russia would love nothing more than to have the U.S. sink billions of dollars and stay here forever, but it seems to be that they're celebrating this. They were touting U.S. humiliation in Afghanistan and a warning to Taiwan and other allies that the U.S. won't come for help if war breaks out. China's embassy is functioning as normal. So what are we doing to counter their propaganda, and how does the administration view Russia and China's engagement with the Taliban?
Well, first, we of course are in touch with the Chinese and the Russians as we work to bring men and women out of Afghanistan, and including our SIV applicants and others. Our message is very clear. We stand by, as is outlined in the Taiwan Relations Agreement, by individuals in Taiwan. We stand by partners around the world who are subject to this kind of propaganda that Russia and China are projecting, and we're going to continue to deliver on those words with actions. Our objective in Afghanistan is to deliver also on what the president promised, which is to not put the men and women who have served our country bravely over the past 20 years in harm's way again. And that's what we'll also be projecting to them as well.
Jen, why was August better than, say, November or December to be getting out?
In terms of the August 31st timeline?
Correct, because this is the Taliban fighting season, and that would not be.
I know there's been a fair amount of focus on that, but I wouldn't say that that has been an assessment of a difference here in terms of what our timeline would have been from the beginning.
So there's no belief that it would have been any different in December than it is in August?
I don't believe that military officials have made that assessment.
As we ask about the risk assessment right now, what is the current risk assessment in terms of terrorism and the potential threat that exists within Afghanistan against the United States?
Well, I think as the president conveyed yesterday and also conveyed back in May, part of our objective here was to make sure we had the resources to fight the counterterrorism threat that has changed over the last 20 years wherever it is. And that has not been emanating from Afghanistan in the way that it was 2 decades ago, which is understandable. We have a range of capacities, over-the-horizon capacities, as well as capacities where we do effective counterterrorism operations in countries where we have absolutely no presence in any way at all. We will continue to watch closely, continue to assess, but I'm not in a position, I'll leave that to our intelligence community to provide an update on. Go ahead.
You said just a little bit ago that, if the Taliban does not agree to these safe passage agreements or conversations, that the consequence will be the full force and weight of the U.S. military. What exactly does that mean? Does that mean there's a scenario where we go back in?
That means that we have been clear, and I think my colleagues at the Defense Department have also conveyed this, that we have our own capacity, military capacity from here. Obviously, we have worked with them to ensure safe passage. That's where our objective is. I'm not going to outline or detail it further.
At
One more. You said, the administration said that the evacuation efforts were stalled in part because some Afghans did not want to leave earlier, they wanted to stay. Do you have any specifics on this population? Exactly how many Afghan allies are we talking about who were eligible to leave but chose to remain?
It's a good question. I can see if I can give you a greater assessment of that. What I can tell you is that of the initial numbers of SIV applicants that were granted visas, there was a good chunk of that number who did not take advantage of those visas and depart. Now, that does not change our commitment. That does not change our obligation. But it's just an important component of the story of the last 6 months. Go ahead.
11,000 you mentioned, just for clarity, those are 11,000 self-identified people in the country, not who want to leave. Do you have any indication of how many Americans are still trying to get out of Afghanistan?
I can see if there's a greater assessment. I would point you to the State Department on that, though. They'd have the most up-to-date numbers.
Do you have a total number of people overall, including third country nationals and Afghan nationals, who you want to get out over the coming days?
Again, there are a number of prioritized programs. I think we've given out some numbers in terms of, if you look at SIV applicants, we have about 22,000 spots at military bases here, an additional 8,000 in third countries. Obviously, we're going to work to assess and make sure we get, and we work to get as many people out as possible who are eligible for those programs, as well as, of course, separately, American citizens. But I don't have a number or an update for you on the total.
I'm sorry, I know they're going to announce this tomorrow, but are we talking about booster shots for everyone? And if so, why should healthy young Americans be getting a third shot when so many in the world don't have a first shot yet?
Well, they will provide a briefing tomorrow on what the recommendations are, and I encourage you to ask a question, as I'm sure you will ask a question at their briefing, Josh, as you've been following this closely. I'm not going to get ahead of their announcement or the president addressing this tomorrow, but I will tell you that we believe that that is a false choice. We can do both, and the United States is far and away the biggest contributor to the global supply, the global fight against COVID. We will continue to be the arsenal for vaccines around the world. We also have enough supply, and we have long planned for enough supply should a booster be needed for the eligible population. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. The National Security Advisor said when a civil war comes to an end with an opposing force marching on the ground, there's going to be scenes of chaos. There's going to be lots of people leaving the country. But my question is, why didn't you have a better plan to secure the airport? How could you not anticipate crowds of people rushing the tarmac and overwhelming limited security if there was a contingency plan in place?
Well, first I'd note something that Jake Sullivan said and John Kirby said, which is, and I'll probably butcher their iteration of it, but basically the best laid plans require adjustment when you get on the ground and see what the situation on the ground is. We have secured the airport in a short period of time. There were initial scenes of chaos, but that has been a priority, and we have accomplished that task. Now our focus is on getting planes in and getting American citizens, SIV applicants, our locally employed staff, some of your colleagues out of the country. But we did effectively do that thanks to the hard work of the men and women on the ground from the State Department and the Defense Department over the last 24 to 48 hours. Okay. Oh, I called on you. Just let me do one more.
Thank you. Just two quick questions. I want to follow up. Jake said that the president had not spoken to any other world leaders yet. Why is that?
Jake also said that our focus right now has been on operational efforts, which includes coordination at a lower level than leaders and heads of state. And that is our focus on working with third countries to help get their citizens out, or, of course, working with others on the ground to get vulnerable populations out. That's where the focus is at hand right now. And if there is a benefit in the president picking up the phone and calling world leader, he will certainly do that, and I expect he will do that in the coming days. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
And live today, a briefing from the State Department, expecting more questions about the situation in Afghanistan. We'll bring it to you live when it starts here on C-SPAN.
Where we are with an hour to go in the Washington Journal this morning. Coming up in about a half hour, there will be a brief pro forma session in the House, and as we always do, we'll take you there live for gavel-to-gavel coverage. It shouldn't be more than a few minutes, so you can stick around and continue the Washington Journal afterwards. At 10 a.m., we're expecting a Department of Defense briefing, and that's where we'll go on C-SPAN in just under an hour. But in this final segment of the Washington Journal, asking for your reaction to President Biden's defense yesterday of his Afghanistan withdrawal, giving his address from the White House yesterday, coming back from Camp David to do that. Here's President Biden from yesterday.
I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. That's why we're still there. We were clear-eyed about the risks. We planned for every contingency, but I always promised the American people that I will be straight with you. The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves. We spent over $1 trillion. We trained and equipped an Afghan military force with some 300,000 strong, incredibly well equipped, a force larger in size than the militaries of many of our NATO allies. We gave them every tool they could need. We paid their salaries, provided for the maintenance of their Air Force, something the Taliban doesn't have. Taliban does not have an Air Force. We provided close air support. We gave them every chance to determine their own future. What we could not provide them was the will to fight for that future. There's some very brave and capable Afghan special forces units and soldiers. But if Afghanistan is unable to mount any real resistance to the Taliban now, there is no chance that 1 year, 1 more year, 5 more years, or 20 more years of U.S. military boots on the ground would have made any difference.
President Biden from the White House yesterday. Here's some of the reaction to that address from the op-ed pages of today's newspapers. From the Wall Street Journal, this is Walter Russell Mead calling it Biden's Chamberlain moment. This from the Wall Street Journal as well. Gerald Saib, a bipartisan blunder from start to finish. This from the Washington Post this morning. Fareed Zakaria, we lost the war in Afghanistan long ago. And then the editorial board of the Washington Times this morning. The return of terror, Afghanistan's fall, makes U.S. border security more essential than ever. Just some of the reaction this morning in some of the national papers. We're opening our phones to you in this last hour, getting your thoughts on phone lines for Republicans, 202-748-8001, Democrats, 202-748-8000, Independents, 202-748-8002, and especially want to hear from veterans of the war in Afghanistan, 202-748-8003. Ann, in Greensboro, North Carolina, you're up first. Democrat, go ahead.
Yes, the Republican administration made an agreement to leave, withdraw from Afghanistan, made the agreement with the Taliban. And my question is, why would you make an agreement with the Taliban rather than the Afghanistan government? Maybe that had something to do with what happened at the time of the withdrawal. And, of course, I think the Republicans realized that they made a mistake with that, because now they have taken, apparently they had the agreement on their website where they were praising the agreement, and now I understand they have taken the agreement down from their website because they realized that that made no sense at this time to make an agreement with the Taliban versus the government.
That's Ann in North Carolina. This is Eric in Lawrence, New York. Good morning. Independent.
Yes, good morning. I just think that President Biden's speech was just a political salesmanship. This country for years has on and off dealt with the Taliban. Am I incorrect that the Clinton administration saw them as positive in fighting the opium trade? And I think Trump was more out in the open. He just continued what had been taking place going back years and years, even to the British. The Taliban have really been the main force there, regardless of the government in Afghanistan. I find them appalling. They are Muslim heretics like the Wahhabi cult. What they did with those Buddhist statues years ago is appalling. But I think this was foreseen, and Trump understood that. I don't think anybody ever really revealed the power of the Taliban. And as I said, this goes back to the British Empire.
That's Eric in New York. That line for Afghanistan war veterans. Johnny in Enterprise, Alabama. Johnny, when were you there?
Yes, good morning. I'd like to know about President Biden's speech. He mentioned an over-the-horizon ability to counter terrorism, but yet we couldn't predict what was happening the last 10 days. And the second item is opium. Thank you.
Johnny, when were you in Afghanistan?
Enough.
I'm sorry? Lost Johnny. This is Steve in Norman, Illinois, Republican. Good morning.
Yeah, I just want to say that to that lady before, she didn't read the whole thing. It was with conditions. They had to have conditions, or Trump would have went in. And our president the Congress should invoke the 25th Amendment on him. He don't even deserve to be dog catcher.
Germantown, Maryland. This is Nate, a Democrat. Good morning.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that this was a total disaster for Biden. He also bears a lot of responsibility for what's occurred, if not all of it. He is the president, and he needs to take responsibility for the disaster that's occurred. On top of that, it's also insulting for him to say that Afghan military and Afghan police haven't been fighting. They've been fighting for the past 20 years and dying in much larger numbers than American forces. So at the end of the day, he needs to take responsibility, and they need to come up with some type of plan for how they're going to leave the country in a much better shape than when we went in.
It's Nate in Germantown, Maryland. Along with that address yesterday from the White House, plenty of coverage throughout the day on the C-SPAN networks on the various events reacting to the fall of Kabul, including that emergency UN Security Council meeting that took place yesterday morning. At that meeting, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, discussed the next steps for refugees in Afghanistan. Here's a portion of what she had to say.
President Biden has made clear that any action that put U.S. personnel or our mission at risk will be met with a swift and strong military response. The United States promises to be generous in resettling Afghans in our own country, and I'm heartened by the pledges we've seen from other nations to do the same. We need to all do more, and the time to step up is now. We urge Afghanistan's neighbors and others in the region and beyond to give refuge, to be it temporary or permanent, to Afghans attempting to flee. And together we must do everything we can to help Afghans who wish to leave and seek refuge.
Linda Thomas-Greenfield yesterday at the United Nations. Taking your phone calls this morning in this last hour of the Washington Journal. Mohammed's been waiting in Los Angeles. Democrat, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. Everybody is here blaming Donald Trump, blaming President Biden for a possible debacle, which I don't see that has happened. But this effort of drawing down our troops was precipitated by former President Donald Trump. And just as your previous guest mentioned, several Taliban prisoners, hundreds, were released by Donald Trump. The U.S. officials met with the Taliban in Doha, Qatar, prior to Donald Trump leaving office without any involvement of the Afghan government. During World War II, we bombed Germany, we destroyed Japan, but then Japan and Germany became our closest allies and are our closest allies. We helped through the Marshall Plan to rebuild Germany. Germans had the resolve to rebuild their country. Afghans have no such resolve. I've been to Afghanistan on many, many occasions over the last 20 years. Afghans identify by their tribe. You ask them, say, I'm an Uzbek, I'm a Pashtun, and so on. They don't identify as an Afghan. And you cannot go and rebuild a tribal feudal society. We gave up over 2,400 service members' lives, tens of thousands injured, over $1 trillion spent in Afghanistan over 20 years. And we couldn't teach them how to become civil and democratic.
Mohammed, did you say you've been to Afghanistan?
Many occasions. I'm in the rug business, area rug business, and over the last 20 years, the U.S. put in a lot of money into infrastructure to help these farmers come off the opium production, so they got them into weaving carpets, rugs. So I've been importing rugs all my life. I was going there. It was beautiful business. And a lot of the women were weaving the rugs, you know. Very little money.
When do you think you'll be able to go back again? Do you think you'll be able to go back?
I don't think I'll ever be able to go back. The Taliban will have to. Afghanistan has no natural resources, you know, so the Taliban will again cultivate the opium business, the opium industry. That's how they're going to make money. This is a problem for Pakistan, for Iran, for Turkmenistan. This is not a U.S. problem. The Arabs have funds. The Gulf nations have funds. They can help Afghanistan if they want. We did it all. We cannot pass a $1.2 trillion package for our own country to help build our own country. Two former presidents couldn't pass an infrastructure bill. We've spent over $1 trillion in Afghanistan, and look, at the end, they had no courage. They put down their guns. Ashraf Ghani looted the coffers and fled the country. Abraham Lincoln didn't flee the country. He gave up his life to save the republic, to save the Union.
That's Mohammed in Los Angeles. Ed is next out of Grand Island, Nebraska. Independent, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my call. I just noticed yesterday and today, watching President Biden give his speech, and it looks like this just kind of off the cuff, but it looks like that he must have fell or something, because he's got a lot of scratches around his upper eyebrows and on his nose. You know, I'm 72 and I've fallen a couple times and it's done the same thing to me, but that's just kind of off the record. But anyway, I think
Ed, hard to be off the record on a live call-in show.
Oh yeah, okay.
But go ahead with your comment. I'm not sure I noticed what you were talking about, but what are your thoughts on the withdrawal? Yeah,
okay. I think that Trump and Pompeo had it probably right. You know, they made the deal with the Taliban, and they drew down from 25,000 or whatever it was down to 2,500 without an incident. And they realized, I think, that the Taliban was going to have to play a role in the formation or reformation of Afghanistan. And I think that President Biden had it in his mind that, you know, he's been so anti-Trump ever since day one. He wasn't going to stick to that, and he just going to bull in there and do it his own way. And in the process, it just blew up in his face.
That's Ed, Nebraska. Phone lines again, if you want to join this conversation. We have a special line for veterans of the war in Afghanistan, 202-748-8003. Otherwise, phone lines as usual. Republicans, 202-748-8001. Democrats, 202-748-8000. Independents, 202-748-8002. We've been showing you some of the op-eds from papers from around the country. Here's a few of the front pages having to do with the effort to get U.S. refugees and diplomats and military personnel out of Kabul from the airport there. We'll show you some of the front pages as we hear from Chickenzie next in Germantown, Maryland, Republican.
Yeah, thank you for taking my call. I just want to comment. I've noticed that everything is about fight in America. It shouldn't be. We should all regret our withdrawal from Afghanistan, whether Republican, Trump, or whoever did that, because America has invested enough. I mean, there's a saying, you can take a horse to the river, but you cannot force a horse to drink. We have done this for 20 years. We've been in another person's country. We gave them everything they need. Whatever they needed to form a nation, we gave them. We can't do more than this. Further delaying in Afghanistan, it means that America is colonizing Afghanistan, and that time is over. We're done. And it's time to move. So I don't blame anyone. I don't blame any president for pulling out of Afghanistan. It's his time, and the time is now.
Paul is next from Texas on that line for veterans of the war in Afghanistan. Paul, when were you there?
Sir, actually, I was there several times. I was there from 2000 and 2000. I was there 4 times, actually, in different smaller trips in supporting role. But really, truthfully, I want to talk about the senior generals as opposed to the President of the United States. The President is the Commander-in-Chief, but I have really been disheartened with a lot of decisions and the politicalization of the senior leaders. I mean, General Milley writing a book in terms these things didn't happen in the past, and I just think that our military is getting more and more politicized. And with that, the senior folks are giving bad advice to the leadership, and that's the only comment I wanted to make. That's my observation.
Paul, what does it mean to be there in a supporting role? What were you doing there?
Supporting medical units, primarily.
Were you?
I don't want to get specifically. I don't want to get specific into my job.
Were you mostly in Kabul?
But no, actually, I was in Bagram. I have been in Kabul. I've been in Bagram. I was down in the Hindu Kush for a while.
And as somebody who's been there, what did you think of that scene from the international airport there?
It's heartbreaking. I mean, it's heartbreaking. One of the missions, and it's primarily a Marine Corps mission, is a NEO or an evacuation type mission of non-combatants. The fact that it just looks so disjointed. That it is so disjointed, and our intelligence took us by such surprise that they were going to take it so quickly, that is a failure, and that is a failure of the senior leadership. Obviously, the president's the commander-in-chief, but again, those senior leadership generals, I'm just very disappointed in they're getting involved in things other than war fighting, in my opinion.
Is there any senior leadership general over the past 20 years in Afghanistan that you think had it right?
I'm sure, actually. Some of them, and actually one of them was relieved. I think from the tactical decision-making, I think our decisions were right. We adjusted to the battle. We adjusted to the enemy. But the political or the larger policy decisions, or what always happened, always hampers the military action. And I think that's where the disconnect was. A lot of our junior leaders, phenomenal. Our soldiers, unbelievable. My brothers and sisters, incredible, to include the Afghanis. I really think that just senior leadership let us down on this one. Over.
Are you in touch with anybody still over there trying to get out?
Anyone over there trying to get out? No. Most of the people that I'm still in touch with, I've been out of the game for a while. Most of the people I'm in touch with are mostly contractors and things like that. And just, getting reports. What you're showing on television is pretty accurate. A lot of chaos, a lot of uncertainty. And unfortunately, they believe it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better.
From the contractor perspective, were they all out by now before this all went down? What do we know about contractors, or what do you know in your contacts with contractors in terms of when they were able to get out?
It's ongoing, truthfully. And some of them belong to some larger companies that are... Hello?
I'm listening, Paul.
Okay, I'm sorry. Some of those are large companies, so they're still negotiating, getting their people out and things like that. But most of them are out. I have 2 individuals that I know of that are still there by choice, quite frankly.
Why by choice, if you can say?
Why by choice? Again, it's it is business. So I believe they're there with their company and they're seeing what their role can be, either post this madness or kind of during this time. They're taking more of a wait and see type attitude. They do have means to probably get out of the country, though. As long as that airport stays open, that is a critical thing. That airport must stay open. So that's the only exit strategy those people have right now that I'm aware of, obviously.
Is there a belief in some of these businesses that the Taliban is going to need them too?
I think these particular individuals are still working for our government. And, again, the specifics of their job and what they're doing, I don't want to speculate.
Well, Paul, appreciate you talking about what you can talk about. Thanks for calling in. Kevin's next in Kansas City, Missouri. Democrat, good morning.
Yes, sir. Good morning. Here's something that people have not really taken into consideration. The Afghans who were trained by the American military, they have more superior weapons than the Taliban. So what happened here? The American-trained Afghans, they laid down their weapons, not because the Taliban had more superior weapons. They laid down their weapons and turned them over to the Taliban because of religious beliefs, because they don't want to see Afghanistan become a Christian country. They have they don't want to see Afghanistan become a Christian country. They have more superior weapons than the Taliban.
Kevin, where are you reading or seeing that it was done out of a religious decision?
Well, when you look at the photos of the Taliban in Kabul, they have these old AK-47s for which they had 30 years ago during the Mujahideen. And another thing is the same thing happened in the 90s when America armed the Mujahideen, and then as soon as the Taliban, the Mujahideen drove the Russians out, they then took those same weapons that America gave them and turned on America. So this is the exact same thing.
In terms of the training, some $83 billion spent on training Afghan forces over the years. Tara Kopp with that story out of defense.
Good afternoon. Apologies for the delay. I know that was a long 2 minutes. Let me just start with an update on Afghanistan. The Department of State is working around the clock to facilitate the swift, safe evacuation of American citizens, special immigrant visa holders, and other vulnerable Afghans. We remain committed to accelerating flights for SIVs and other vulnerable Afghans as quickly as possible. The safety and security of U.S. government employees and U.S. citizens overseas is our top priority as well. The Department of Defense has secured Hamid Karzai International Airport so that military and commercial flights can resume. Our staff on the ground is communicating with American citizens in Kabul who are not at the airport with instructions on when and how to get there. We have communicated to the first tranche of American citizens who have requested evacuation assistance. Our team is working hand in glove with military colleagues to help load planes safely and securely and as fast as possible. We've now completed our drawdown to the core diplomatic presence we need, and at this time, we will no longer need to facilitate departures for our embassy personnel. All remaining embassy staff will be assisting departures from Afghanistan, and the department is surging resources and consular affairs personnel to augment the relocation of American citizens and Afghan special immigrants and elsewhere, adding personnel to assist with P1, P2 adjudication processing. We've successfully relocated many of our locally employed staff and are in direct contact with the remainder to determine who is interested in relocation and the process for doing so. Ambassador John Bass, a seasoned career diplomat and former ambassador to Afghanistan, Turkey, and Georgia, is heading to Kabul today to lead logistics coordination and consular efforts. A career member of the Senior Foreign Service, Ambassador Bass brings decades of experience from service at 7 U.S. missions overseas and in leadership positions, including Executive Secretary here in Washington. Ambassador Wilson, who has remained in Kabul, will continue to lead our diplomatic engagement. At the same time, there is intensive work by our Afghanistan task force, with colleagues working 24/7 here in Washington and at posts around the world. This is a whole of government effort, and we will continue to respond quickly to evolving conditions. Secretary Blinken has been in constant contact with his foreign counterparts. Just today, he spoke with Qatari Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mohammed Abdulrahman Al Thani, and Kuwaiti Foreign Minister Sheikh Ahmed Nasser Al Mohammed Al Sabah, thanking them for assistance in facilitating the transit of U.S. citizens and Embassy Kabul personnel through Doha and Kuwait City. He has also continued to be in close and regular contact with the President and the broader national security and foreign policy team. So with that, happy to take your questions.
Just extremely briefly on Ambassador Bass. What exactly, he's going to oversee the evacuation?
So this is, in addition to every...
If that's what it is, that why didn't he go, several days ago or last week?
So this is a massive logistical undertaking. Our presence, our diplomatic presence in Kabul, this is a focus of theirs. Obviously, there is a lot of other important business that needs to get done, from management to engagement with Afghans. And so what Ambassador Bass will be doing is overseeing the logistics of this rather large, rather ambitious, expansive operation. He'll be using and leveraging his managerial expertise and logistics experience to help Ambassador Wilson and the broader Embassy Kabul management team with this challenge.
I guess, but he's not going there to negotiate with the Taliban.
He is not. He is going there to work on the nuts and bolts of this, just given how logistically challenging this is.
And then, I'm sure you saw Jake's briefing at the White House, but he said that you do have an agreement with the Taliban to allow safe passage for people to get to the airport. My question is, though, if you have such an agreement for that, how long does it go for? And then two, if you have an agreement for the airport, why couldn't you have gotten an agreement for the embassy? Why just leave this very expensive, large compound empty and open for whoever wants to go into it?
Well, to your first question, we have received assurances from the Taliban that they will allow safe passage to civilians transiting to the airport. Let me just be very clear about this. We take it for what it is. These are the words of the Taliban. We will, of course, be looking for one thing and one thing only, and that is follow through. It is our expectation that they allow safe passage, that they allow us to conduct our operations on the Hamid Karzai International Airport compound, and that, of course, they not target civilians who are making that transit to the airport. I would reiterate another point here, and that is that it is not just the United States that is calling for this. It is not something that is merely enshrined in international law. Yesterday, I spoke about a joint statement that the United States put together with 98 signatories over the course of the past day. The signatories have grown. There are now over 100 countries, countries from Albania to Zambia, who have signed on to this statement, calling on all parties to respect and facilitate the safe and orderly departure of foreign nationals and Afghans who wish to leave the country. Part and parcel of that is safe passage to the HKIA compound.
There are embassies that are not evacuating, that have not left. The Chinese and the Russians are still there. They're going about day-to-day business. So
this is a sovereign decision that every country will have to come to. When it comes to the United States, you have heard us say before that this president has no higher priority. Secretary Blinken has no higher priority than the safety and security of Americans who are serving overseas. That is why, as the situation began to change rapidly, late last week, we made the decision to begin relocating our embassy presence to the airport compound. Of course, that was accelerated as the conditions continued to evolve in the ensuing days. Myra.
Ned, can I get some meatier reaction from you on Taliban press conference? I'm sure you've seen they've made a number of assurances, and the world obviously takes it with a pinch of salt. Jake Sullivan spoke to it a little bit. He also said that he wanted the team to be able to talk to Taliban. What does that exactly mean? What is the U.S. plan in terms of engagement? What is the bigger strategy going forward in terms of recognizing them? And I want to squeeze in the second one while I can. Kosovo, Albania have said they'll take in SIV applicants. North Macedonia also did. Uganda did. Could you give us a few details about the plan here for these countries in terms of numbers And what is the latest in the negotiations with Kuwait in terms of SIV applicants?
Great. There's a lot there. Let me try and remember all of that and take it in turn.
I will remind you if you need
Okay, I'm
me
sure
to.
you will. So when it comes to our engagement with the Taliban, we made clear yesterday that even as the situation on the ground began to change markedly over the course of the last week, we remained engaged with Taliban interlocutors in Doha. This is the channel that had been operative for some time that we use together with the international community to support the intra-Afghan dialogue. Of course, through our support for the intra-Afghan dialogue, we took part in separate discussions on a regular basis. Every time the special representative for Afghan reconciliation was in Doha, he would meet separately with representatives of the Islamic Republic, that is to say, the government of Afghanistan and Taliban representatives. That has continued. That continued over the course of the weekend. Now, as the situation began to change, of course, so too did the focus of those talks. It became less narrowly focused on achieving a political outcome and supporting that, and it became much more focused on the safety, security of our people on the ground, of civilians on the ground, everything that we could be in a position to do to limit any violence, to limit any bloodshed in Kabul. So that is the channel in Doha. We have also said that there has been engagement with the Taliban on the ground in Kabul. This is a military-led channel. It is a channel that is tactical, that again is focused rather squarely on issues like safe passage for civilians. That is what we are working on concertedly right now. It is manifestly in our interest to have these open channels of dialogue with the Taliban. Again, as you heard from the National Security Advisor, we have received assurances, but what matters, the only thing that matters to us are actions and not necessarily just words. We're going to be looking for the follow-through. We'll be looking for the deeds. I mentioned in the context of safe passage, a statement that the United States galvanized and released about 48 hours ago, a little less than that, regarding safe passage for civilians in Kabul. There's another notable document that I called your attention to yesterday, but is still rather noteworthy in this regard, and that's the statement that emanated from the UN Security Council. The unanimous statement of the UN Security Council calling for the immediate cessation of all hostilities and the establishment, through inclusive negotiations, of a new government, and a new government that enshrines, that protects, that upholds the basic rights of all Afghans. So this is something we continue to support, a political resolution to what we are seeing unfold. Perhaps even more importantly, this is something the international community continues to support in very tangible ways, including by speaking unanimously as the Security Council, which, as you know, is often not an easy feat. These are some of our...
This was all yesterday.
That's right.
What about the press conference today?
Which element of it?
Well, I mean, what is your reaction to it? You've heard them give a number of assurances. How are you going to form your strategy?
Well,
are you thinking about recognizing them? All of this is like, I get it, but you've said very similar things, almost identical yesterday.
Again, any future relationship between the Taliban and the United States, or the Taliban and much of the international community for that matter, which is what we saw reflected by the UN Security Council, is going to be predicated on deeds. Words matter, words are important, words can be reassuring, words can signal, but what we are going to be looking for are deeds. We want to see the follow-through. If the Taliban says that they are going to respect the rights of their citizens, we will be looking for them to uphold that statement, to make good on that statement. Just as importantly, the world is going to be looking for them to make good on that statement. The United States will be watching closely, and the broader international community will be watching closely with us. Yes, Christina.
On that point, you said you have an agreement with them to let civilians pass checkpoints into the airport. We've heard from multiple Afghans. My colleagues are interviewing a family right now who were stopped at checkpoints by the Taliban and prevented from getting to the airport. This is not a singular case. Furthermore, President Biden yesterday said some of the Afghans who qualified for SIV status chose not to leave. When Jen Psaki just spoke, she said there was a contingent that did not take advantage and depart. That's a different thing. And what we've heard from Afghans on the ground is they didn't depart because they couldn't get to the airport. Is it my understanding that the U.S. is still not providing any transportation either to Americans or to SIVs trying to get to the airport to depart on these flights?
I'll tell you what we are doing. We are doing everything we possibly can in a very fluid and dynamic and challenging security environment.
I understand that,
to bring to safety as many people who wish to do so. There are broad categories of individuals that we're prioritizing. In the first instance, we repatriated many of our embassy staff.
Ned, that's not my question. My question is, are you providing any kind of transportation for people who need to get to the airport? Are you considering a safe zone around the airport to make it easier for people to access these flights if they qualify?
We are doing everything we can in a challenging and dynamic security environment. We are engaging with the Taliban. We've heard these assurances of safe passage. Again, their words are only worth their words. We are going to be looking for follow through.
They're not following through, is what I'm telling you.
We are watching very closely, Christina. This is a fluid situation. My colleague mentioned, we notified the first tranche of American citizens in Afghanistan yesterday who had, overnight I should say, who had expressed an interest in being repatriated to the United States. Many of those individuals arrived at the airport. Many of them have been repatriated. U.S. military flights today.
But two of them are telling us right now they can't get to the airport and they've gone back home.
I can't speak to individual cases. What I can speak to is what we are seeking to do. We are doing everything within our power to effect a corridor of safe passage for civilians. Of course, that includes American citizens who are seeking to make their way to HKIA for repatriation, safe passage for other civilians, whether those are Afghans who have been referred for P1, for P2, for the SIV program, for our locally engaged staff at the embassy. We are going to continue to do all we can. This is a dynamic, it's a fluid security environment. If we're in a position to do more, I can guarantee you we will do as much as we can.
That's not something you can do at the moment.
At the moment, we are doing everything we can to allow civilians to be able to transit to the airport. Our message remains for American citizens and for others who have expressed interest in relocation out of Afghanistan. Shelter in place until and unless you receive a communication from the U.S. Embassy. As I said, we notified the first tranche of American citizens overnight who had expressed interest in being repatriated. In those messages, we provide specific information about precisely where they should go on the airport compound, and it tells them precisely when to go. This is, again, a challenging security environment, so unless and until individuals are instructed by the U.S. Embassy to make their way to the HKIA compound, we are asking them to remain in place.
Right, but these are people who have been instructed and they can't get there. So what is your advice to the Americans who have been notified, they have the email from you, they have the instructions, they can't get there, they went back home, they're hiding in their apartments?
We tell them in our communications that their safety needs to be their top priority. If they feel that it is unsafe for them to make their way to the airport, they should not seek to do so. We will continue to do all we can and we will continue to be in touch with them, I should say, to provide clear guidance about when and how they should make their way to the airport compound. Andrea.
Can you answer the SIV question before we move on?
Sorry,
you didn't address
what was the SIV question?
You guys are having all of these talks with Kosovo, Albania, and what is the latest with Kuwait? Secretary had a phone call with the Kuwaiti foreign minister.
So the secretary did have phone calls today, plural, with Kuwaiti, with his Kuwaiti and Qatari counterparts. He took advantage of those calls to thank them for their willingness to allow safe transit of individuals who we are relocating from Afghanistan. We've received in recent days, even recent hours, we've heard very generous offers from a number of different countries. Some of those offers have been very public, as in the case you referenced. Of course, our neighbors to the north, Canada, has demonstrated extraordinary generosity in opening their doors for individuals who wish to relocate from Afghanistan. We are in touch with a number of countries who may be interested in hosting or in some way facilitating the safe passage of individuals seeking to depart Afghanistan. We are also asking countries around the world to step up to demonstrate their goodwill, their generosity of spirit to these vulnerable Afghans that the United States, and I should say the Department of State, working hand in hand with the Department of Defense, is doing everything we can to relocate.
Do you have a number for Albania, Kosovo, Kuwait, or in total?
I don't have a number to give you right now. Andrea.
Can I ask a couple of questions, Ned? First of all, what confidence do you have in the Taliban statement that women would be invited into the government and can have certain freedoms, but under Sharia law?
Well,
what does that mean to you?
Well, I think what will matter is what that looks like. When and if we see it put into practice. Throughout this process, whether it was in Doha, whether it is now on the ground in Kabul, whether it is us parsing the Taliban's public statements, we have never taken them squarely at their word. We have listened to what they have had to say. We have assessed what they are saying publicly and privately, arraying that against everything else we know and have heard and have learned. But throughout this process, we have never taken them squarely at their word.
By definition, just by their words, consign women to a different category than other workers in the government or others that they are talking about?
Andrea, we've heard quite a bit from Taliban officials over the past hours and even several days. We are taking stock of everything that they have said. Most importantly, we are going to be looking for how they comport themselves, at the way they treat their people, at how they fulfill the solemn obligation they have to respect the basic and fundamental rights of all of their people, including half of their citizens, the women and girls of Afghanistan. But I will say, it is not just the United States that is watching closely. What is even more important here is that the international community is doing that. You saw that expressed in no uncertain terms by the UN Security Council, and you have seen any number of countries come forward to say that they may be able to work with the Taliban if they guarantee these fundamental and basic rights of their citizens. Conversely, and this is important, any government that denies those rights, that ignores the freedoms, the liberties, and the basic rights that every person on earth should enjoy, a government that harbors terrorists, a government that takes hostages, that is not certainly an entity that the United States could work with. And we've heard countries around the world say something very similar.
Well, let me parse that, because you're talking about the Security Council. A member of the Security Council, China, is moving towards recognition of the Taliban already,
Well, look,
without any guarantees of human rights or any other guarantees.
It just so happens that China, the People's Republic of China, is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. So I can tell you precisely what they said when they signed on to the statement on August 16th.
But what they're doing today is moving towards recognizing the Taliban.
I am going to have to defer to officials in Beijing to speak to what they're doing. I can tell you precisely what they signed on to, precisely
But what does that tell you about their intent?
I'm not here to divine the intent of the PRC government. I am here to point out precisely what they have signed their name onto. The PRC government signed off on.
We've seen the resolution.
Well, and it's an important. It is an important piece of paper because not only the PRC government, but other permanent and other members of the Security Council also signed on to it. But let me just make the point on the PRC and other governments. It is not only this UN Security Council statement. We have spoken, including in recent days, of a number of groupings of countries that have over the course of months or even longer, lent their voices and their efforts to supporting an intra-Afghan dialogue, supporting a political settlement between the parties. When it comes to the PRC, they are a member of the Extended Troika. The Extended Troika, as recently as recent days, has spoken with one voice about the need for a negotiated political settlement through a process that is owned and led by the Afghan people. A forceful takeover that ignores the basic and fundamental rights of those very Afghan people would not be consistent with what we have heard from any number of countries, including the PRC.
history, Ned. We do. We've got limited time, and we've got a lot of questions.
I will come right back to you, but let me just, because I think the context is not unimportant. What is also true is that when we came into office, there was a large backlog of SIV applicants, who had waited months or even longer. We have gone to extraordinary lengths since the earliest days of this administration to shorten that backlog, to cut some of that red tape. We have worked with Congress.
Congress says that it's only because of their pressure that you were way behind, not you personally, but that the State Department lagged terribly on this and that they had to force this legislation.
This was a backlog, Andrea, that we inherited. When we came into office in January 20th, there were thousands upon thousands of special immigrant applicants who were in this backlog. We have been gratified to find a partner in Congress. We have worked with Congress to cut some of this bureaucratic red tape. Again, it's a 14-step process. So on top of that, as the security situation began to change, of course, our embassy went on ordered departure on April 27th. Even with the ordered departure, we were able to surge additional resources to Kabul, consular officers specifically, to take on some of this backlog and to make progress. Just as we did that, we moved some of the functions that previously were being conducted in Kabul to the United States so that we could have even greater resources dedicated to that. With those steps, we were able to cut many months off the average wait time for SIV applicants. Our embassy in Kabul, I should say, did all of this under stressful and tense circumstances and amidst a COVID outbreak. COVID, of course, was a limiting factor in terms of how much not only the last administration was able to do against this backlog, but also for us, especially as COVID took a particularly severe turn at our embassy in Kabul. Over the course of April, May, June, July, if you look at the average processing times, we shaved significant processing times off of each of those
over the course of those months,
applicants.
You've gotten 2,000 people out.
That is not true.
Well, you're up to 2,000. You just said 2,000 was the number you said.
2,000, if you would let me finish. So on top of all that, we started an ambitious, aggressive relocation effort, Operation Allies Refuge. We have relocated 2,000 Afghan special immigrants through Operation Allies Refuge. Many more, hundreds more special immigrants were traveled to the United States before Operation Allies Refuge began.
Correct. So since Allies Refuge, you've gotten 2,000 people out. 2,000. You now have less than 14 days to get how many? 40,000, 60,000? With a limited staff at a tiny embassy that you're operating out of the airport. I'm not impugning the difficulties for the State Department employees. I am sure they're working hard. I'm sure they're trying their best. But do you really think logistically it is possible to make any kind of a dent in that and get those people out? Furthermore, what is the order for who is coming out of the airport? Is it, you said it's not embassy staff anymore, so it is American citizens, then SIVs, then who is coming out in what order? And if I'm a woman or a girl and I show up at the airport, does that qualify me as a P2, as a person of special consideration?
So a couple things. We are going to do, and we are doing, as much as we can for as long as we can to relocate, to bring to safety, whether that is to the United States or elsewhere, vulnerable Afghans, whether they are SIV applicants, whether they have refugee status, whether they fall into other vulnerable categories. You've heard from DoD that the Department of Defense has been in a position to relocate tremendous lift capacity. So now that the airport is under the control of the Department of Defense, not only U.S. military aircraft have been able to land and take off, but also charter aircraft. It is also a goal of the United States and our international partners to see to it that the commercial flights are able to take off and land. This is something that we are working on very closely with our partners, with Afghans on the ground. The reinitiation of commercial operations would add tremendous capacity to those seeking to relocate from Afghanistan. In terms of prioritization, of course, our first priority, our first responsibility is always going to be to the American people. So we've spoken of our relocation, repatriation of our direct hire staff. That has now completed for the time being. I told you today that we have notified the first tranche of private American citizens who have expressed an interest in being repatriated to the United States. So those Americans, we're not offering numbers, but it's the first tranche, and I expect several tranches of Americans and their families, given them explicit instructions about where and when to go. And we are going to do as much as we can for as long as we can for refugees or other vulnerable Afghans who may be interested in relocation. Nick?
Just a couple ones. So the embassy staff that are still in Kabul, is it your expectation that they will remain in Kabul indefinitely? And would they potentially return to the U.S. Embassy, or would that constitute recognition of whatever government comes next? I mean, are you thinking that they will leave once all these priority groups have been taken care of?
Right now, Nick, we're focused on the mission at hand. And the mission at hand is precisely what I was describing to Christina. That is an effort to relocate, in some cases repatriate to the United States, in other cases to relocate to third countries, as many individuals as we can over as much time as we might have. Right now, we are thinking about this in terms of August 31st. If it is safe and responsible for us to potentially stay longer, that is something that we may be able to look at.
Stay longer, meaning the diplomatic presence that's on the ground now.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Diplomatic presence that's on the ground now. You're referring to them potentially staying longer?
Look, our first responsibility has to be to the safety and security of our team on the ground. That is precisely why our embassy went on ordered departure on April 27th. It's precisely why we conducted successive drawdowns of the embassy team after April 27th. It's precisely why last Thursday we began the relocation to the Hamid Karzai International Airport and why we accelerated repatriations of our embassy staff after that. We are going to do as much as we can for as long as we can for vulnerable Afghans.
Okay, so then on Doha, just given what you said earlier about priorities shifting from, negotiations with the Taliban to, the other priority of reducing bloodshed, I mean, given that senior Taliban leaders are now returning to the country, is it your expectation that Doha is essentially dead and it's time to shift those conversations to some other format? I mean, what more can be gained out of Doha if senior Taliban leadership are now back in the country and apparently or seemingly would have no incentive to negotiate power sharing when they basically control the entire country?
Well, we believe that continued dialogue has the potential to be constructive. As I said yesterday, dialogue to date has had constructive elements. We have heard things that were welcome. We are going to be looking to that follow through. So not the entire political office. The entire political office has not relocated to Kandahar or other parts of Afghanistan just yet. There are still Taliban representatives on the ground in Doha. But you are right that in many ways the center of gravity is shifting from Doha to Afghanistan. We will continue to adjust. As I said before, we adjusted the focus of our dialogue as the conditions on the ground began to change rapidly in recent days, and we'll continue to do that going forward.
Thanks. And then one last one from me, just following up on your issue of mention of vulnerable groups and women being included in vulnerable groups. Would women in Afghanistan automatically qualify for P2 status given their gender and the threats that the Taliban have made or the way that they've treated women in the past?
So they're really two different things. There is a so-called priority 2 referral status for those who are referred to the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, and that is defined in a set of categories. And to paraphrase, it's individuals who have worked for U.S.-based NGOs, individuals who have worked for U.S.-based media organizations. I should say on that score, I think as many of you know, we expanded the definition of employment to see to it that stringers and contractors and those working on assignment can also qualify for the P2 program. But then, Nick, there's a separate category of so-called vulnerable Afghans. These are Afghans who, because of the course of their work, their advocacy, their name recognition, what they have done over the years to stand up for the rights of their fellow Afghans who may be especially vulnerable. That's what we mean when we refer to
what about their gender?
Vulnerable I'm sorry?
What about their gender? I mean, is that...
Well, in many cases, they have stood up and been forceful advocates for their fellow Afghan women and girls.
But what's the process for that? Do people need a referral of some kind at this point? You know, and if you're committed to safely evacuating them, why have them still go through this sort of paperwork in order to get out of the country?
So when it comes to referrals, there are we are and will be looking to relocate as many Afghans who may fall into the P1 and P2 categories as quickly as we can. We are going to continue sending very specific communications to American citizens, and we will provide guidance to others who may fall into these other categories about when and how they should seek to leave the country. In some cases, that may be through the U.S. military. In some cases, there may be charter operations. I can tell you that there are a number of American NGOs, private organizations that are seeking to charter flights to bring to the United States or bring elsewhere individuals with whom they have worked on the ground over the course of many years. So yes, the United States government has mounted this ambitious, large operation to bring to safety as many Afghans as we can for as long as we possibly can. But we have also been working very closely, including many people here at the State Department, working very closely with private American organizations, with NGOs who are also engaged in an effort, including in some cases with potential charter options. Yes?
If the US was unable to foresee the speed of the fall of Kabul, even with the Taliban down the road, when it comes to spotting an emerging threat from Al-Qaeda, for example, shouldn't your allies now expect substantially less from the US government?
We talked about this some yesterday, but it is especially important to us. In some ways, it is especially important to us because it has a direct bearing on our top priority, and that is the safety and security of the American people. We know a couple things to be true. Over the course of the past 20 years, terrorist groups that have been active in Afghanistan, principally Al-Qaeda, the group that the United States military went into Afghanistan in October of 2001 to pursue, has been degraded and decimated. That is absolutely true. The terrorist threats that have emanated from Afghanistan in recent years have certainly not been on the scale of what we saw pre-9/11 or in the years post-9/11. And there's a couple reasons for that, but the overriding reason for that is the fact that our military and our broader U.S. government partners conducted their mission to degrade and to decimate that Al-Qaeda network there extraordinarily effectively. They accomplished the goal that successive American presidents set out for them. It is also true that when our service members, special forces, intelligence agencies first went into Afghanistan in the early part of this millennium, they were operating with a set of tools that were far less effective than what the U.S. government can muster now. Over the course of the past 20 years, technologies, strategies, tactics have been honed have been refined, and we've seen the results of those in the degraded
and where
state.
were those tactics and techniques last week as Kabul fell?
These are two separate things you're talking about. Let me just talk about the terrorist threat, and then I'll go to what you're referring to. When it comes to the terrorist threat, we have heard from our intelligence community that we have the capacity to observe and to respond decisively if we see a threat emerge in Afghanistan that poses a threat to the United States.
What if you don't see it because you're not there? Contractors are gone.
Andrea, there are many places where we don't have American forces on the ground, where we can and where we have responded decisively to terrorist threats that have emerged. Yemen is one example. Parts of Syria is another example. I could give you a litany of countries where we don't have service members, where we have responded effectively and decisively.
Service members in Syria.
In parts of Syria, I said, where we have responded effectively and decisively. Now, what you're referring to is something entirely different. What you are referring to is the fact that we were taken by surprise. It is undeniable that we were surprised at the pace by which the Taliban were able to pursue their territorial advances and the speed with which they encroached on Kabul. But the decisive factor there was the way in which the Afghan National Security Forces, a force that, on paper, far outmatched what the Taliban had to muster by at least 3 to 1. 300,000 trained, well-equipped Afghan forces that had an air force, that had heavy equipment, that had special forces, that had received technology from the U.S. government. There was not the capacity or the will. They could not find the capacity or the will to take on the Taliban advance. On top of that, there was the political question that was also unexpected. As you know, President Ghani and some of his colleagues left the country. They left the country quite suddenly. With those two elements converging, it is absolutely true that we were surprised at the speed at which the Taliban were able to approach Kabul. But that has nothing to do with the ability that we have and that we will retain to take on terrorist threats that may seek to threaten the United States.
The Taliban today said they will not harbour foreign fighters to launch terrorist attacks abroad. Do you believe them?
Again, we are going to listen to their words. What we will be looking for are their actions. It's their deeds that matter to us, especially on a matter of utmost importance like this. Connor?
Non-Afghan question? Go ahead, but can I get a non-Afghan question?
Well, there is relative comment in Kabul. There are reports of atrocities in other cities that the Taliban hold. Before the fall of Kabul, the embassy was corroborating some of those reports. Do you have anything to say about that? Do you have any confirmation of whether or not some of these atrocities have been committed, extrajudicial killings, harassment of women, things like that?
We are going to be watching very closely. Right now, as we've said, this is a fluid situation. We, of course, had seen, and the world had seen, atrocities occur over the course of weeks and months as the Taliban's campaign progressed. Over the past 72 hours, the conditions on the ground have changed dramatically. We are going to be watching very closely for a couple reasons. Number one, we are going to be working with the international community to do all we can to provide humanitarian assistance, to provide support to vulnerable Afghans, Afghans who may be at risk going forward from the Taliban. Now, of course, they claim otherwise, but we are going to be poised to work with the international community to pull every lever we can to use every tool at our disposal with the international community to provide support and assistance. But two, there's the question of what comes next. The question not only of what the United States does vis-a-vis a future Afghan government, but what the international community does. And so this is another reason why we're watching very closely. We have made very clear our expectations of any government with which we could be expected to work in Kabul. If that government doesn't respect the basic rights of its own citizens, including the rights of its women and girls, that is not a government that we would be expected to work with. Importantly, it's not a government that the rest of the world, or at least much of the international community, would be expected to work with. And finally, but there's a tangible element to this, and it's a point that is quite important because it has practical implications. It is more than a matter of political recognition or diplomatic connectivity. It is a matter of, in some ways, it's an existential question. It has the potential to be an existential question for any government. We know that the government that had existed in Kabul over the past 20 years could not have endured were it not for the support of the United States, the largest bilateral donor, were it not for the support of the United Nations, were it not for the support of the international community. The same could well be true of what comes next. It is a question of carrots. We certainly have carrots in terms of the assistance that any future government in Afghanistan might be expected to need, but also the sources of leverage that we've talked about. The fact that working with our partners in the international community, working with the UN, there are significant costs that collectively we would be able to impose on any government that does not respect the basic rights of its people, and that's something we're prepared to do.
So you're saying that the behavior of that future government is what matters. What happened to the idea that any government imposed by the barrel of a gun is what mattered?
We have always said that we, like our partners in the international community, supported a political settlement. We believe, present tense, we believe that a political settlement stands the best chance of offering protection, offering inclusion for the people of Afghanistan. We continue to believe that. If you take a look at what the members of the UN Security Council said, they continue to believe that.
But this group has seized power by force now, and they don't care about those statements of what you believe. This is a terrorist organization that now has control of the country, and you're saying that their future behavior is what you'll weigh. How does what has happened for the last week and a half, months, not matter more?
All of this absolutely matters. All of this absolutely matters, and what we're saying now will matter. It will matter to any future government, not so much because the United States is saying it, but because, as you've seen over the past couple days, the international community, a broad swath of the international community, the countries that are in many ways will be most important Afghanistan's neighbors, important stakeholders in the region, some of the most generous countries on the face of the earth, the countries that had allowed the Afghan government to endure over the past 20 years. When we're speaking with one voice and we're talking about assistance, potential assistance, and we're talking conversely about the tools, the implications, the sources of leverage that we are prepared to wield against any government that does not respect the basic rights of its citizens, those are more than words. Those have practical consequences. Matt.
There's an assumption in the question that you answered it positively. I just want to make sure that it's correct. Do you believe that the Taliban has taken power by force at the barrel of a gun?
There has not been a formal transfer of power. Of course, it's a fluid dynamic. There are ongoing discussions between Afghan leaders following.
But the question was, you said you would never recognize or deal with a government that had seized power at the barrel of a gun. You're not prepared to make that statement yet that the Taliban has seized power at the Barrel of Gun, right?
We are taking stock of what has transpired. There continues to be dialogue between Afghans, between representatives of the Taliban and representatives of the Islamic Republic.
You say that also that the center of gravity has shifted from Doha to Afghanistan.
Right.
Isn't it clear from what's happened over the past couple of months that the center of gravity was always in Afghanistan and never in Doha, and it was basically a waste of time?
I'm not.
In Doha.
Look, we are not prepared to say that. We're not prepared to say that
because what happened in Doha has accomplished a great deal.
Matt, when you
sarcastic, I just want to know. I mean, do you think that anything that has been achieved in Doha since February 2020 is actually accomplished?
The intra-Afghan dialogue, the discussions between the Afghans, in this case, the Taliban and the representatives of the Islamic Republic, those are ongoing. It matters very little whether that happens in Doha, whether that happens in Kandahar, whether that happens in Kabul. All along, our goal has not been to be prescriptive. Our goal has not been to forge a consensus, to create a consensus. Our goal has been to support that intra-Afghan dialogue, and it's an intra-Afghan dialogue that remains ongoing.
Can I ask, did you get an answer to my question about Bahrain from the other week? And if you don't have it right there, I can get it later from you. But then secondly, the secretary you put out a statement semi-late last night about the secretary, it was a comment from the secretary about the legislation in Poland.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering if anything has changed since then, because the Israelis seem to have a stronger reaction than you did, at least on the restitution part. And I'm wondering and suggesting that the U.S. and Israel, that they and the U.S. would be taking some kind of joint action. So is there anything new on that since the statement from last night?
Well, you're right. We did issue quite a strong statement from Secretary Blinken. What he made clear is that we are deeply disappointed by amendments to the Code of Administrative Procedure that restrict compensation for property wrongfully confiscated during Poland's communist era. We have said all along that Poland is an important NATO ally. The alliance we have with Poland, the alliance we share with Poland and our other NATO allies, is based on, among other things, mutual commitments to democratic values and to prosperity. And so with that in mind, the Secretary and the broader department, we have urged the government of Poland to demonstrate its commitment to these very shared principles, and to make good on that, indeed. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Can you, if you do have something on Bahrain, can someone get it to me?
Yep.
Hey, on the people going to the airport.
Yeah.